Egypt dispatched its 26th aid convoy from Rafah to Gaza via Abu Salim border crossing. Lebanon's parliament speaker calls for unified efforts to rescue the country from its current crisis. And the Russian president arrives in China for a 4-day visit.
والله العظيم ولا حبة رز، والله العظيم ولا حبة عدس. ما فيش أكل، ما فيش شرب، عندي بنت 2.5 صارت تشطب.
The news in detail. Egypt has dispatched its 26th aid convoy under the Zaid al-Izza provision of honor from Egypt to Gaza initiative from Rafah to Gaza via Abu Salim border crossing. The second batch of the 26th humanitarian aid convoy has departed Egypt for Gaza via the Abu Salim border crossing following the entry of 80 trucks from the first batch, with truck arrivals ongoing. The current convoy numbers in the hundreds, loaded with diverse goods, including baby formula, flour, oil, sugar, cheese, canned meals, and legumes. Today, 180 trucks entered Gaza through the same crossing. However, the Israeli occupation forces continue to block medical supplies and allowed only 3 fuel trucks in. Meanwhile, hundreds of tons of aids have been destroyed due to Israeli restrictions on entry. Aid delivery to Gaza faces major hurdles, including Israeli inspections, restricted crossing security, threats, and damaged infrastructure, worsening humanitarian needs. Well, for more analysis, we now move to Riham Morsi in our newsroom. To you, Riham.
Thank you so much, Mona. To help us better understand how these aid convoys go into Gaza, we're joined from Cairo by Al-Ahram managing editor Mohammed Izzeddin. Thank you, sir, for joining us here on Qnews. Firstly, sir, let's start off by asking, how do prolonged Israeli inspections at the border crossing impact the timeline and effectiveness of aid delivery into Gaza?
Thanks for having me in Qnews. Absolutely. Despite the great effort exerted by Egypt as transporting and granting 30% of the humanitarian aid to the Palestinians and continuously opening the crossing to Pata, the authorities of the Israeli occupation hindering such aid through the prolonged measurement into the Palestinian territories in order to be diverted to the Kerem Abu Salam border crossing, to be exposed to the process of inspection. So the Israeli authorities hindering in the aids of the quantities that are required for elevating the suffering of the Palestinian people suffering from the genocide, in addition to the starvation war that caused the famine in the Palestinian territories. Having given that Egypt is upholding its diplomatic humanitarian roles along with the mediators to mitigate the pains of the Palestinian people and executing diplomatic policies to pressure the occupation forces and the cabinet to cease fire and to reach ending the humanitarian catastrophe suffered by our brothers in Palestine, specifically in the Gaza Strip.
Well, sir, now there are limited operating hours at the Kerem Abu Salam crossing. How does this restrict the volume of humanitarian aid entering into Gaza? How does this affect, I suppose, the lives of Palestinians because of these restrictions?
Absolutely. Firstly, the authorities of occupation forces refraining the entering the vehicles in Friday and Saturdays. In addition, since the failure of what is called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, that contributed targeting the defenseless civilian Palestinians while seeking the aids. After its failure and regaining the international system, in addition to allow the vehicles coming from Egypt, from Rafah crossing to Kerem Abu Salam, and to prolonged restrictions and the reluctance of entering the several vehicles, this would undermined the needs of the Palestinian people. Upon His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi said that Gaza is in need of 600 to 700 load trucks to be entered daily, and Israel reframed this to take place. All this triggered the international condemnation, and in addition that this aren't sufficient for the Palestinian people. In addition, the entering some materials and putting constraints to enter some other materials such as fuel.
Also, now, obviously, since the onslaught on Gaza, 70 to 80% of Gaza has been destroyed, including the infrastructure. Now, what are the consequences of damage to the infrastructure as well as roads within Gaza on the internal transport and distribution of aid, especially now that also there are restrictions, not just, destruction of the roads?
Absolutely, this is war crimes and a humanitarian catastrophe committed against the Palestinian people. Firstly, the occupation forces bombarded the roads headed to the crossing roads and made the entrance of the vehicle through Kerem Abu Salam crossing, and most of the internal roads were bombarded, and they are out of service and aren't paved properly. That take very long time for delivering the vehicles. In addition to they were exposed to the summer strikes. In addition, the full destruction of the infrastructure such as electricity, water, and the water disposal, and targeting the hospitals along with the pro-clinics. In addition, all caregivers or medical crews or even media personnel are systematically targeting with repetitive strikes in order to make sure that they are killed. So such inhumane practices aren't amounted for any solution than spoil any attempts to stop in a very limited size of the massacres against the Palestinians, specifically in the Gaza Strip. It is a systematic destruction of infrastructure by the Israeli occupation forces and a very direct refrain and hindrance of entering the aid after the failure of the GHF, in addition of killing on daily basis the Palestinians. Most of them were women and children, along with those who were seeking humanitarian aid.
Okay, now with the security situation deteriorating inside Gaza and, hunger mounting, how does this specifically hinder the distribution of aid, especially to those who are most vulnerable or hard to reach?
Certainly, the occupation forces are doing its relentless effort to minimize the quantities that were entered by the pressure of Egypt, mediators, and the United States. After the massacres were exposed, war of starvation was exposed, the occupation to refrain and hindering the aid, not only by striking the infrastructure and the impaved of internal roads, and the load trucks were exposed by the lootings, either by the families or other groups. So they're making it very much difficult for the Palestinian civilians to gain their rights. The quantities are very minimum, in addition to the prolonged time of entering the aids, along with killing the defenseless civilians of women and children who are very much in dire need of the humanitarian needs. So the whole system is running the world to refrain the humanitarian aid. So despite that Egypt has fully succeeded to enter the humanitarian aid either by diplomatic pressure or along with the international institutions and the pro-nations for the Palestinian rights. Following the starvation war against the Palestinian people.
Okay, thank you so much. That was Mohammed Izzeddin from Cairo, the Ahram Managing Editor. Thank you for joining us here on Qnews. And now we go back to you, Mona Musadhi, in our studio.
Thank you so much, Rihan, for the analysis. Back to our bulletin. And European Union foreign ministers remain split over how to respond to the ongoing war in Gaza, with some pushing for strong economic pressure on Israel, while others held back. Ministers also called on the United States to reconsider its decision to block Palestinian officials from participating in the upcoming UN General Assembly in New York. Denmark's Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen criticized the Israeli actions, saying they undermine the possibility of a two-state solution. He warned that failing to act could empower extremists on both sides of the conflict.
Denying visas to Palestinian authorities so that they can't proceed.
The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the UNRWA, has said it has been barred from bringing shelter supplies into Gaza for nearly 6 months as Israeli military operations intensify and displace thousands more people. UNRWA warned that overcrowding and a continued Israeli blockade on humanitarian aid are leaving families without shelter. The agency said the worsening humanitarian crisis is being driven by both the lack of access and ongoing military action. UNRWA renewed its call for unrestricted access to deliver life-saving supplies. Gaza-based health authorities have announced that the death toll from Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip has climbed to over 63,400 and over 160,200 others wounded. The Gaza Ministry of Health has reported that hospitals in the Gaza Strip have received 88 dead and 421 others injured in the past 24 hours. The Gaza Ministry of Health has reported that 30 were killed and 166 wounded as a result of the Israeli bombing of 8 centers in the last 24 hours. It also reported that the number of victims from the bombing of 8 centers has risen to more than 2,200 deaths and more than 16,600 wounded. Israeli forces have conducted a series of overnight raids across the occupied West Bank, arresting 9 Palestinians. 6 individuals were detained during operations in several towns near Bethlehem, while 2 were arrested in Halhul near Al-Khalil. In the Amari refugee camp near Ramallah, Israeli troops searched a home and arrested 1 man. Forces also raided homes in the village of Baita near Nablus, reportedly damaging property and deploying snipers on rooftops. The raids are part of an ongoing Israeli campaign across the West Bank amid rising tensions. Thick columns of dark smoke were visible from Israel after Israeli forces launched overnight strikes on the suburbs of Gaza City, destroying homes and forcing more families to flee. The assault comes as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's security cabinet prepared to meet Sunday evening to discuss plans for a major offensive to seize Gaza City, which he has called Hamas' last stronghold. While a full-scale ground assault is not expected for weeks, Israel has intensified operations around Gaza City in recent weeks, recently ending pauses that allowed aid deliveries and labeling the area a dangerous combat zone. The military say it aims to evacuate civilians before deploying more ground forces. According to Israeli media, 10 Israeli families have recently moved into a new settlement neighborhood in the occupied West Bank. This marks the first expansion in the Kiryat Arba area in decades. The local council stated the goal is to sever the geographical connection between Palestinian lands from Al-Khalil to the Negev desert and reinforce ties between Israeli settlements in the region. All Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank are considered illegal under international law. Thousands of activists and supporters gathered at Barcelona's marina to send off the global Sumut flotilla, a civilian mission aiming to break the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza. The flotilla sets sail amid heightened tensions and a long-standing blockade that has been in place. In June, Israeli naval forces seized a previous flotilla mission. Global Sumut flotilla is the latest civilian effort calling attention to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and urging an end to the blockade. Around 5,000 pro-Palestinian protesters gathered on Venice Lido to call for urgent action on the war in Gaza, carrying flags and banners. The peaceful demonstrators assembled near the island's main water bus station and marched slowly along the high street towards the Venice Film Festival venue, about 3 kilometers away. Organizers said the protest was not intended to pass security checkpoints or disrupt the festival events, aiming instead to raise awareness without interference. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced that Israel launched a joint military and Shin Bet operation targeting Hamas. Spokesperson Abu Ubaidah Netanyahu expressed uncertainty about the outcome but hoped that Abu Ubaidah had been eliminated. He added that the operation reflects Israel's ongoing effort to strike key figures within Hamas. Netanyahu's remark came during a government meeting emphasizing the significance of this targeted effort, while the final result remained unknown. Later, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz announced the assassination of Hamas spokesman Abu Ubaidah. Israeli media has reported that the cabinet meeting venue was moved to a more secure complex due to threats from Yemen's Houthi group. Israeli media stated the meeting expected tonight will focus on ongoing operations in Gaza. Reports indicate the Security Cabinet will not discuss detainee release talks or the partial deal Hamas approved. The Israeli media, quoting an Israeli official, reported that the session will concentrate solely on launching the Gaza military operation, despite security chiefs urging debate on the partial deal. Israel insists it will not resume negotiations with Hamas without a full settlement framework, aiming to subdue Hamas under the 5 key conditions. Families of Israeli detainees in Gaza have protested outside homes of key ministers in the Israeli Security Cabinet, demanding a prisoner exchange deal with Hamas. Israeli media reported demonstrators called for an end to the Gaza war and the return of all detainees, chanting against the government's disengagement policy. The families revealed a detainee deal proposal exists but hasn't been discussed by the Security Cabinet, even as the ground offensive endangers detainees and soldiers. They urged ministers to prioritize returning their loved ones alive or deceased, condemning government actions for deepening conflict and destruction across Israel. Moving on to Egypt, where the British Embassy in Cairo has announced the temporary closure of its main building following the removal of surrounding security barriers by Egyptian authorities. In an official statement, the embassy confirmed that emergency consular assistance remain available. Those with pre-booked consular appointments are advised to call the same number for updated entry instructions. In Sudan, the rapid support have shelled military positions and residential neighborhoods in El Fasher, North Darfur's capital. According to the Sudanese Doctors Network, 7 civilians were killed and 71 injured in deliberate rapid support artillery attacks, which they labeled as genocide and a horrific massacre. The Sudanese Doctors Network asserted that El Fasher faces systematic extermination through bombardment, siege, and starvation in blatant violation of international law. They condemned global silence, holding the rapid support fully responsible, and blamed the international community, United Nations, and African Union for failing to protect civilians and halt the atrocities. The World Health Organization has reported that 260,000 people in El Fasher, Sudan, remain cut off from humanitarian aid. That comes as El Fasher has been under siege for over 500 days, severely restricting access and resources. The WHO emphasized the city's critical health needs, especially as medical supplies have long been depleted. The prolonged blockade has exacerbated the health crisis, leaving thousands vulnerable without essential care. WHO's warning highlight the urgent necessity for aid access and medical replenishments to prevent further deterioration of public health in this besieged city.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Lebanon's Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri has called for unified efforts to rescue the country from its current crisis. Berri warned against the spreading rhetoric of hatred within the country. He expressed openness to calmly discuss Hezbollah's weapon, emphasizing that any dialogue must occur within constitutional boundaries. Lebanon's Parliament Speaker firmly stated that no discussions on Hezbollah's arms will take place under threats or coercion. His remarks underline the importance of peaceful legal discourse while cautioning against divisive language that could deepen national instability. The Israeli occupation military have conducted a series of destructive airstrikes targeting the Ali al-Tahir area in Upper Nabatiyah in southern Lebanon. Lebanese reports noted Israeli warplanes also patrolled over multiple regions. That came as over 10 Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon highlighted more than 100 violations of the ceasefire agreement in recent days. Despite the ceasefire effective since November 27th, Israeli occupation forces remain stationed at 5 border points, continuing sporadic breaches and escalating tensions in the region. Moving on to China, where Egypt's Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli has took part in an official dinner hosted by Chinese President Xi Jinping, marking the beginning of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Plus Summit events. At the start of the dinner, held in honor of the attending leaders and heads of states and governments, President Xi delivered a speech in which he highlighted the challenges facing the current international order and the positive role the Shanghai Cooperation Organization can play in addressing those challenges. Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Tianjin, China for a 4-day visit. He was welcomed upon landing by officials before proceeding by motorcade. Putin will participate in the 2-day Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit hosted by Chinese President Xi Jinping alongside about 20 world leaders. After the summit, Putin will travel to Beijing for talks with Xi and to attend a grand military parade on September 3rd, marking the end of the World War II following Japan's surrender. This visit underscores deepening Sino-Russian cooperation amid global geopolitical shifts. Chinese President Xi Jinping held bilateral talks with the leaders of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Maldives on the opening day of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Tianjin. Xi met separately with Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and Moldavian President Mohamed Musil in the northern port city ahead of a larger gathering of around 20 world leaders. The 2-day summit, the SCO's largest since its founding in 2001, will include key figures such as Russian President Vladimir Putin and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. That brings us to the end of our news bulletin. Here is what we've been covering. Egypt dispatched its 26th aid convoy from Rafah to Gaza via Kerem Abu Salem border crossing. Lebanon's Parliament Speaker calls for unified efforts to rescue the country from its current crisis. And the Russian president arrives in China for a 4-day visit. This concludes our news bulletin for the hour. Don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at Qnews EGY to stay informed. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.